And that has been with me. I've never questioned my abilities.
Welcome to the Breaking Bias podcast, formerly Diversity on Fire, the show where we explore the stories and experiences of people from all walks of life. We are on a mission to inspire new thoughts and dialogue in an effort to challenge bias and cultivate connection. I am your host, Heather, and joining the conversation today is Dr. Frank Douglas. Dr. Frank is a global thought leader and dedicated to providing impactful and life-changing solutions. His accomplishments range from over 24 years in the pharmaceutical industry, 16 years as the head of research, a CEO, board member, entrepreneur, and author of Defining Moments of a Free Man from a Black Stream, and the recently published Addressing Systemic Discrimination by Reframing the Problem. Welcome to the show, Dr. Frank.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
You are most welcome here, and I'm so excited to dive in and learn about all of your experiences. Before we get too far along, though, I do always like to start the show, as we've talked about, by having you share a bit about your origin story. So we're talking about your formative years, your years before 25 years of age, basically. Things that impactful that might have happened, family dynamics, things that really you feel like might have shaped your life.
Well, I was born in Guyana, which was then British Guyana. It's now Guyana, to a very poor family, single mother with four siblings. The five of us lived in a single room, shared bathroom, shared kitchen with other families that lived in similar single rooms. I was fortunate in that I was a good student, ended up getting a scholarship to go to one of the small private secondary schools. You have to pay to go to secondary schools in Guyana. And I did get a scholarship and then won a scholarship to go to the top. At that time, it was an all-boys school. It's called Queen's College. I also, during that time, was very much involved in the evangelical church. And as a matter of fact, after I graduated from high school and was working for a year and a half or so, trying to raise money so that I could go abroad and study, I actually was the director for the Youth for Christ movement in Guyana during that year and a half. I was quite fortunate in getting a Fulbright scholarship to come to America. I actually came to America 60 years ago. On September 20th, 1963, actually 8 days before Dr. Martin Luther King's famous march in Washington. So that's my background story.
Okay. And yeah, so we're just a week or so away from that 60-year anniversary. And you mentioned the March on Washington and the actual speech that he gave, the I Have a Dream speech, and you were there, is that correct?
No, I was not there. I was actually at Yale on an orientation program for the Fulbright Fellows and Scholars. And it was actually quite interesting. And the reason why this is so memorable for me is that 3 days after I arrived, I was supposed to make a presentation in the group I was in. And I was not feeling well. I had significant pain. I went to see the professor before the start of the session and explained to him that I was not feeling well and in fact needed to see a doctor. And he looked at me and said, you Black students are always finding excuses. Now you are a Fulbright scholar. You're going to have to learn to work hard to earn that honor. I was stunned. Fortunately, I knew where to find the director of the program. I went to see him. He took me to the Yale New Haven hospital, where I was immediately admitted and was there for 60 days. 60 days, sorry, I was there for 10 days. what was interesting is that after I was discharged from the hospital and on my way to Lehigh University, which is where I did my undergraduate, I learned that Martin Luther King had made this wonderful speech. And one of the things he said was that he hoped one day that his children would live in a country where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I had just, after being 3 days in America, been judged by the color of my skin and not the content of my character. That, unfortunately, was my introduction to something that surprised me, and that is racism in America. In the Guyana at that time, America was this great, wonderful country where everybody is beautiful, wonderful, kind, thoughtful, ready to help everyone. So it was quite stunning to me to discover this, what I call the ugly side of America.
What kind of, I want to call it whiplash almost, must that have felt like for you? Or maybe a better question is, how different was it from Guyana in terms of how you were treated just walking through, a neighborhood versus coming here, how you were looked at and treated?
Well, as I mentioned to you, I grew up in a very poor family, and I never felt that I was poor until I came to America. Suddenly, I realized that, oh, we're really very poor. People treated you with respect, even though you were poor. And there was discrimination in Guyana, mind you, but it was not this, what I would call, this ugly, vicious type of discrimination. You had discrimination in America, particularly for the fairer complexion, the lighter complexioned blacks, did tend to have greater opportunities to get certain types of jobs. But apart from that, there were almost no differences. So it stunned me when I, about 2 weeks after I was here, then discovered that, as a matter of fact, there were churches I could not attend because of the color of my skin. And as I mentioned to you, I grew up in the evangelical church. It is still a puzzle to me. It was then, and it's even more so now, because one of the things we always talked about was the one of the disciples asking Christ, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Christ saying, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart," and without being prompted said, "And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So I grew up with that, and you called it whiplash. It was, to say the least, very confusing. As a matter of fact, after 2 years in the U.S., I actually came down with an ulcer as I was trying to really reconcile my religiosity with what I was learning and what I was seeing in America. I remember being in the hospital, and the doctor said, uh, "Is there anything that is bothering you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, this is unusual. You're a track star, you're a very good student, you're a campus leader, you don't smoke, you don't drink, and you have an ulcer." A couple of days after, as I lay in my bed thinking about this question, I suddenly realized that, as a matter of fact, I was spending a lot of time worrying about the way I grew up and the way Christianity was taught to me, and particularly the evangelical brand of it. How do I reconcile that with what I'm seeing in America?
And how did you? Or are you still religious? And if so, how did you reconcile that?
Well, I didn't reconcile it. Interestingly enough, uh, the one person in my life, one male, whom we called Uncle Willie, who was very kind to my mother. In fact, at one point when I was about 16, invited us to come and live with him because he had a bigger place. He was probably the gentlest man I ever knew, the kindest man I ever knew. And as I lay in my bed, I suddenly said, what I need to do is to be like Uncle Willie, be kind to people, be generous, and not to deal with organized religion because I cannot make sense of it here. And that's what I did. I stepped away from organized religion and basically said that now I need to live my life based on the principles that I learned as I grew up and to be kind to others, etc.
That is, it's interesting to hear. I am in the same boat as you. I cannot reconcile that. I hold no ill will against anyone who has religion of their own, but it's just something that I have not been able to come to terms with, just because I find a lot of hate from people who seem to want to think that their way is the only way of life.
Yes.
I want to touch on, because we're talking about right now, early on in you being here. And I think when we hear about your experience with discrimination then, even though it was not that long ago, oftentimes people will say, oh, well, we've come so far. So I wonder if you could share, because I know that the discrimination and experiences that you've faced are a big factor in the work that you're doing now. So I wonder if you can share some other specific experiences that happen over time, and maybe even ones that are more recent, if you have them.
Well, I do. I do have many, and even though I tell people I tend to, or I choose to think about the wonderful things that have happened. But I'll mention a couple. One of which is very instructive because it actually is involved in the recent book that I published and led me to it. After I completed my Ph.D. at Cornell, I was hired by Xerox. And for 3 months, I could not get on a meaningful project. And one day, a young white man joined the group. He had not completed his PhD. In fact, he was writing his thesis. And within 1 week, he was placed on the most desirable project that we had in research and development at Xerox. I went to see my boss to find out when I would get a good project. And after he, went through the usual that I'd heard before, I suddenly said to him, Steve, instead of thinking of me as though I'm Frank, think of me as though I'm Bob. And I was actually stunned to see almost a recognition come over his face as he said to me, Bob has only been here a week and I've put him on the artery project. Well, I was furious. I ran out of his office, went to the senior vice president to give him yet another example of how I was being discriminated against. Now, a number of years later, I thought of that incident and realized that I'd missed two things. One was that senior vice president had hired 3 young black PhDs that summer to join the 1 black PhD that Xerox had at the time. So it probably was much more important to him that Frank Douglas would do well than it was to Frank Douglas. So I missed that. The second thing I missed was my desired outcome was to get a good project, not for the senior vice president to have tough words with my boss. So had I reframed and had I said to the senior vice president, could you ask Steve, my boss, to find me a good project? I might have retired from Xerox because that was clearly within his sphere of influence. And could you imagine the senior vice president, 3-4 levels higher than my boss, walking into his office and simply saying, find the man a good project? That would have happened yesterday. So that began to help me to look at episodes of discrimination differently and try to reframe. I'll give you another example of this